fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. It's January 20th, Inauguration Day here in the United States. And on this day, we are releasing a two-part conversation with my friends Riyaz Tayyibji, Shubhra Raje, and Sarosh Anklesaria on the vexing question of the proposed demolition of Louis Kahn's IIM dormitories. It's a two-part conversation. The first is today, and the rest to follow in our next episode. Here we go. I hope you enjoy the conversation. The issue of mid-century modernism under erasure is such an important one, and I hope you find a way to engage this conversation via this podcast. Welcome to Architecture Talk, Sarosh, Shubhra, and Riyaz. Thank you so much for being here. This is the second of our conversations that I'm going to try and have on this raging controversy of the Indian Institute of Management's proposed demolition of 14 of Louis Kahn's celebrated dormitories, which of course, from what I understand, is currently, at least temporarily, on hold. And I'm hoping to have a conversation with you about your initiative to stop this demolition. And as intellectuals and practicing architects, I want to get your opinion on what's going on and why this is happening now and what is the future of this legacy of modernism in India. So, but it's one of those rare instances where I have three of you on a single podcast. So let's go around and first hear from you. Why don't you introduce yourselves? Well, Riyaz, you have been on my podcast before. So, but tell us where you are and what you're doing nowadays.
Well, Vikram, thank you once again for having me on your podcast. And of course, with Sarosh and Shubhra, it promises to be a conversation, as always, to look forward to. Well, I'm in Ahmedabad, as you know, and presently I run a small practice called Interior Design, which I have for a while. And Sarosh and I were co-founders of that firm and often practice together. But what I am really engaged with at the moment is I'm a consultant to the National Institute of Urban Affairs for the preparation of the heritage conservation plan of the walled city of Ahmedabad, which has been inscribed as a World Heritage City. So heritage has been something I've been engaged with and thinking about in many ways for the last few years, quite in a focused manner. However, I think that the association with modern heritage is one of more personal interest than is either professionally or something that I've been looking at academically. So, I mean, I just like to put it in that way for the moment.
And more controversially, because modernism constantly has this contradiction inherent in it, whether it can be both modernist and preserved, like the IIM position seemed to be, well, things 50 years old can't be preservable. But anyway, we'll come back to this discussion. What's the contrast between the old city of Ahmedabad and the new modernist heritage? Sarosh, you have already been given your cue by Riyaz. Tell us where you are and what you're doing.
Thank you, Vikram. I'm currently in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture, where I am doing a fellowship. I've been teaching for a long time now, and I have always tried to combine both practice and academia. This is something I really aspire to, and I aspire to having the platform to connect the two. So as Riyaz mentioned, I collaborate on projects in India, but I also write, I do my own research, I do projects that don't get built. And then, of course, all sorts of ways in which one can tie various different strands together because one has kind of done different diverse things.
Right.
So I want to say that
Renaissance man, a man of many talents, yes?
not really, desperately trying to make sense of different things that are, sometimes come together and sometimes miserably don't. But I just wanted to say that I grew up in the old city of Ahmedabad, and my parents would bring me to IIM when I was 5 and 6 years old. And at that time, I obviously didn't have any idea that I would become an architect. And I have therefore sort of had the view of IIM over time. And it has somehow meant many things to me in my own personal life as well. And of course, then going to SEPT as an architect, and then somehow also in a strange way, being reacting to this, Korb and Kahn being beaten on you day in and day out at SEPT. And so I kind of went away from that. I worked for Herzog & de Meuron. I worked for Dillers, Coffidier and Renfro, almost as a way of trying to find another view of looking at things.
Yeah.
But one comes back a full circle, and these projects never go away. They always haunt you.
Fantastic. That's an interesting, amazing trajectory to your life. And now the sort of journey from the old city of Ahmedabad to IIM, for which you have to cross the one and only Sabarmati, seems like a topic that is slowly coalescing already by implication. And we'll see if Dillers, Coffidier, and Herzog and de Meuron have anything to do with this. But Shubhra, how did you get entangled with these two on this issue? Of course, you will tell us. First tell us where you are, where you're supposed to be, and introduce your practice, please.
Hi, Vikram. Thanks for inviting me for this podcast. I'm very happy to be here, especially with two friends and prospect of making a new one. And it's probably fitting that I'm sitting here in a little village called Kilcreggan in West Scotland, because I think my manner of practice and teaching is also equally not as much nomadic as just sort of adding bases, almost like adding wagons to the main engine sort of a thing. And in that sense, pretty similar to Sarosh, that you're trying to see where your education, both as an architect, but in general, how many things can you sort of make relationships with and make connections to have certain interests and thoughts be explored through various forms of practice that at least your architectural training allows. So,
right.
I'm a practitioner. I have a sole practice. So,
based where? Ahmedabad?
I have two bases. One is in Ahmedabad, and the other one is in Denver. These are all circumstantial, no grand plan.
Wow, you are global, huh? Ahmedabad and
in
Denver.
name only, in appearances.
Meanwhile, you're in Scotland. I mean,
yes.
Wow.
But in each case, I like to say that once I'm there, I kind of burrow and embed rather than sort of spread horizontally. So, so in each case, the footprints are rather small. But I have a practice and I teach both institutionally, but also sometimes if there are interesting collaborations, then shorter workshops in the spirit of experimentation, really, of how to push certain thoughts ahead. And entanglement with IIM, oh my, there are various strands of that. One, of course, is because my father, Anant Raje, is probably one of the sort of post-independence architects in India of note, both as a practitioner and a teacher. And his association with Kahn, of course, also is well documented. He went to Philadelphia to work with Kahn, although not on the IIM project, actually. He worked on other projects. Islamabad Assembly, which wasn't built, but was concurrent, being one of them. And then when he came back, apart from his Kahn had requested that he sort of get involved in the IIM, that thus far in India was handled first by the NID, with Doshi sort of coordinating it. And then once my father went back, they made a partnership with my father being really the active partner.
Right.
Anyway, so that's sort of the history. He had a site office at the IIM, so I sort of know IIM more as a playground really than as an architect for a long time. And then so there has been that association. But of late, I think in general, I have been interested in our association of modern architecture, our presumed familiarity with it, both as architects, but also in general as users, because I consider us as users as well. And to try and actually dig a little deeper in terms of this familiarity, because a lot of the times what is familiar is probably the most difficult to know. We begin to take things for granted.
Correct.
And our imagination around it begins to diminish.
Right.
So since about 3 or 4 years, I've been taking my design studios as well as workshops in a manner in which we may re-inhabit these sort of modern works of significance and question some of our assumptions around it and get away from the mere reputation of it. So it's in a way sort of ironic that we sort of find ourselves here today talking about the IIM.
In terms of, particularly in the context of question of heritage.
Yeah, and I was just telling Sarosh and Riyaz, we had just done a studio last semester with my colleague and friend Kevin Lowe on IIM and dismantling reputations and yet looking at the built environment as is, with as really thinkers, not as fans.
Let me probe that concept a little bit with you, Shubhra, because in one sense, I so deeply identify with you. You know, your father. Yes. I have a father who was also an architect,
yes,
who worked closely with Korb instead of Kahn, and I struggle, let's say, very personally with this business of inheritance, which is a word which connects to heritage, right? And in fact, I have to send you this. My book on my father's work just came out.
Oh, so, fabulous! I would love to take a look at it.
It was released 3 days ago. I want to describe it as a struggle. This thing that you were describing about the studio that you did with your colleague. So obviously you have a very deep personal connection with this IIM destruction, right? It's in a sense your father's project. Yes? It's like a double heritage, right? How did you emotionally, personally respond when you first heard that IIM was planning to demolish 14 dormitories?
Yeah, it is. I've heard this often about, the burden of inheritance, really, and legacies. Ever since actually I decided to start teaching, I think an interesting pivot happened. So, of course, like Sarosh mentioned, whether through blood or through forms of, call it indoctrination or call it sort of just education.
Intellectual blood.
Intellectual blood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I like that concept.
Exactly. You sort of, as all human beings, you go through various phases of dealing with your patrimony, in a sense, right? So yes, of course, I had my own sort of thoughts about how do I begin to find my own voice growing up within, if not loud, fairly deep and resonant voices.
No, loud, deep and resonant. Let's not pull any punches here. I remember your father, so.
But interestingly, I suppose in terms of being now blood related, he actually was the most, in a sense, the least serious at home in terms of this patrimony. In that, I remember at least my sister and I having a childhood where we were always encouraged to seek connections beyond rather than in terms of become too precious about these legacies. However, I think it was really once I decided to start teaching that I realized that the inheritance was actually, it made more sense and I could do something with it if I sort of thought of it as a collective inheritance. In the sense, it's I have something here I can share.
Yeah.
So normally I try to talk about my experiences coming from a more embodied position. So I try and I try to go the direction of a storyteller, of whether it's the Shodhan House or Sarabhai House or IIM or even some of Charles's work, since I worked with him, rather than as an expert, either through proximity or through study. And what I found there is that in this constant retelling, I myself am engaging with these works that otherwise would have just become something like an heirloom that is sitting there as an object.
Okay, but let me press the point. Describe to me very specifically when you first read the email or you received the call.
You know, Vikram, actually, it didn't come as a surprise, because I had seen HCP's master plan almost in 2013 or something of the sort. And I actually remember having a conversation with Bimal socially when we had seen the master plan, and there was some in the master plan, especially the MDC was slated to be demolished. And at that time in our conversation, he had brought about this point of the entrance of the IIM currently where it is in the old campus was a problem because of the flyover. So it doesn't have a frontage, and the irony there, of course, being HCP itself was in charge of the flyover. But that apart, so I was familiar with the master plan, and in one manner or another was trying to sort of at least first try and understand the motivations behind the master plan, because they were very, very radical. It was a very radical way of looking at a campus, which up until now had a continuity in terms of, from Kahn to my father onwards. So it took a few years just to understand the motivations. To go even further, in 2000, when my father ceased his association with IIM, 2000 or 2003, we are still trying to pin that exactly. There were already winds of change, because the then director already was exhibiting a very different attitude to the built environment and where IIM wanted to go. I think it was a gentleman called Mr. Dholakia. So by the time we find ourselves in December of 2020, it didn't come as a surprise. So I wouldn't say I was emotionally distraught, etc., etc. Also, of course, we have been dealing with these erasures in India, whether it is from Babri Masjid onwards, and most recently close to home, Pragati Maidan, and then the Central Vista. In some way, even emotionally, not just intellectually, one was prepared for this. And one can also see, I think even Curtis has written in 2014, etc., that one can already see and sense that modern heritage or modern architecture has all sorts of pressures on it in India. The development of a dialogue being one of them. This time, what was different was, because of my familiarity and because of existing fellowships to do with Kahn, I felt a little more empowered to do something, if nothing else, at least in terms of putting various people in touch with various people. So if that makes sense, it really wasn't, I think my mother was probably more emotionally, how would I put it, that sometimes you feel a pit in your stomach, that 40 years of work has the potential to sort of be just erased.
Right.
Hers was, I think, a little more emotional that way for a while before you begin to sort of ground yourself a little bit in what's going on. And my sense, I think honestly, it didn't come as a shock, more as sort of a dismay. And then immediately the mind switched to, what can one do here? Is there, first of all, anything one can do? So seriously, just pivoted to what's going on. And then going into all of this with the questions that we were asking in the studio the previous semester. So it's actually been it's not been emotionally distressing as much as putting into action and practice some of the things that one has been thinking and seeing how far it can go.
Well, let's come to those questions in a moment. But let me ask Sarosh and Riyaz, not unexpected for you guys too? Or were you surprised by this decision? Or what was your reaction? Sarosh, what are you thinking? Were you in Pittsburgh? When and how did you react?
Yeah, so of course I was aware of various currents and various developments that had already taken place in India, as Shubhra mentioned, Pragati Maidan. So the general kind of environment was familiar to me, but I did not expect that it would.
And it's global. It's not just India.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely global. But I did not expect that it would go so far. And I did think that there were certain things that were somehow untouchable or somehow would escape this onslaught of, erasure. And so I was completely taken aback. I was shocked. I felt paralyzed. I couldn't sleep the first night I saw that message. I kept turning and tossing in bed, and I kept telling myself, we can't just sit back and let this happen and sort of grumble about it with our friends, that it just didn't seem right. So it took us a couple of days. And during that time, I spoke with Riyaz and with Shubhra. And it took us a couple of days to figure out what should be done. And I think there was some sense that writing this letter to IIM might be a way to go. Of course, individually, it wouldn't mean much. And already by the time we kind of put our thoughts together on this, of course, William Curtis's letter and also Prem Chandavarkar's letter was being circulated. And so there was a sense that one could build some pressure by having this letter published in social media and so on, and generally bring the design fraternity into one voice. Because one thing we kind of felt almost intuitively was that the design fraternity at large, however nebulous that term is, would be aghast by this idea of demolishing these buildings.
For sure. You were tossing and turning in your bed. What about you, Riyaz, sitting in Ahmedabad, next door to you?
Well, actually, I had that that experience in 2014. So at the time that Shubhra mentioned, when the new master plan was, I think, released for the first time, and there were rumors that the hostel buildings were going to be demolished at that point in time. And I remember calling up everybody in that morning, friends in Delhi, Anand Bhatt, Professor Chaya. I mean, the whole modernist
mafia of Ahmedabad, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And like, how can this happen? And I remember sitting at the breakfast table, actually a little bit in shock, trying to imagine Ahmedabad without IIM. I actually, the entire kind of, if you like, a kind of animation of the history of the city, and no IIM. And it just, there's this big void in my imagination. But that happened in 2014. And I think given what's been happening in institutions and their dismantling, not only architecturally, and what has interested me perhaps is more the political and the policy level dismantling that has taken place, which obviously will then have an impact on the architecture and the way the administration administers architecture, takes care of it, and so on. And I think that that's something that's been more on my mind. And therefore, what really interested me this time around was the document of the tender notice, and the way it was constructed and the way that it was put out. And I think that really, I responded to quite emotionally, because of the carelessness and the kind of thoughtlessness of it. Not to say that, and it's very easily been kind of polarized into a debate of constancy versus change, or however you want to frame it, into this kind of polar thing. And it wasn't about the change. It wasn't actually about the demolition, a word which is never used in that document. In that document, it never says that they are going to demolish. It does say that it's going to replace. Reading that document over and over, you get the sense that, these buildings are aging and they've served their purpose and old things must go. And there's this kind of natural sense to the way it's put together. And I was just like thinking about that with the fact that there's a really weak architectural brief given at the end. In fact, there's no kind of direction to what the future architect who has to deal with those buildings is supposed to do, or the way that the institution kind of guides them in a direction of how to be careful with this legacy. And I think those things were what I was responding to. This whole kind of the background to architecture, which then makes architecture a fait accompli one way or the other. So it wasn't really about the demolition this time around. That had already happened.
But you said you reacted emotionally.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Sarosh was turning in his bed all night. What were you doing?
I actually switched off, and I have to say, very honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that Sarosh was so deeply affected by it and decided to act, I think I would have probably looked at this as an introspection, a period of let's look at this as a kind of, let's look at it intellectually, in some ways avoiding the emotional engagement by kind of pushing it away and looking at it objectively. Sarosh's engagement got me engaged into this. And I think that it happens sometimes because being in Ahmedabad and having seen the Hall of Nations pulled down, you can get a little bit, how would you say, disillusioned by what you can do. I think Sarosh's distance allowed that emotion to be much more active than perhaps mine. I was perhaps more resigned in what to do with it.
Indeed, that's a good point, Riyaz. There's a certain paralysis in the sense that comes from too much proximity, which is familiar to the symptoms and prognoses around trauma, for instance. When you are much too close, there's a certain kind of a paralysis.
I think it's interesting because I think it was a lot of, at least in my experience, a lot of people who are not architects who kind of nudged architects to think about it a little bit more. And maybe Shubhra will tell you about the way that the IIM alumni responded, or let's say the way the press actually responded, both local as well as global. And the fact that the local press were really, really not aggressive, but concerned. I would really say it seemed like it wasn't just about the story, and it was about putting this out there in a certain perspective. So I must say that there were all these kind of triggers which were perhaps were able to get you out of the paralysis.
Sarosh, did you want to say something there?
I just wanted to say that week after the 23rd of December, so 23rd of December is when the letter to the alumni went out. And from that point on, that week after that was really, really critical. So it took us 2-3 days to, I think, overcome our perhaps collective paralysis. And then we put the letter together. I used some help from also some of my mentors, Lilichi at Cornell, Kai Gutshaw here at Carnegie Mellon to work through it. And of course with Riyaz and Shubhra. And then we put it out on the 27th. And in 4 days, so in the second day, it already had 177 signatories. And mind you, we sent this out not on social media. We individually wrote emails to people and then asked them to circulate it. So it went out in a kind of word of mouth way, because we wanted to target a certain representation of people. And then in just those 5 days, so by the 31st, it already had 669 signatories and representations from 30 countries and over 100 universities all over the world. And I think so that first week was really critical because it helped build momentum. And of course, when this was happening, there were all kinds of other letters being written. ICOMOS, the International Council for Monuments and Sites, the World Monuments Fund, they all sort of were putting pressure on IIM.
So in that sense, I mean, Kahn is one of the father figures of modernism, right? We don't like to use the word master anymore, but nevertheless, he occupies a certain paternity, which is well criticized, deeply criticized in the intellectual and academic literature for that kind of a thing. But it's complicated, right? Now let's come back to you, Shubhra. I mean, I experienced this myself personally when my father's, big project, Tagore Theatre that he built in Chandigarh was destroyed. And that was destroyed in the name of heritage because this architect, completely gutted the building and retained the envelope and called it a preservation job, which was, just ridiculous. Which is in part also the logic of the IIM, where they say, well, the optics from a certain place will be retained and it will look. So there's always this question of heritage as optics and heritage as something else. I'm further interested in this kind of entanglement, since we brought this word up earlier, between the intellectual critiques of high modernism, which I have written, you have written, a lot of us have written and worked on, and this moment of emotional decapitation. So let's take a strong word, right? And I'm trying to sort of pull you back into your mother's orbit a little bit.
We were just talking about this yesterday, since there is a situation right now where we are in a little bit of a pause, right? That IIM has sort of said they're going to hold a little bit and review again. So we are sort of at the Rubicon, so to speak, figuring out what's the next step. And I was thinking yesterday, because we've been talking about, modernism, etc., and I was really thinking about Kahn first, and then issues of patrimony. And Kahn is a very interesting sort of an inflection point, in a sense, because apart from the known historical categories, etc., but in general, he's not really a high modernist in terms of Corbusier, etc., because in a sense, he did a strange pivot where, from the sort of seamless abolition of the room, etc., a certain kind of an uncritical transparency that began to follow 1920s, 1930s, Kahn suddenly actually brings the room back. In India especially, even more so than Bangladesh, in India what happened was that at the time he, at least, and we are getting to know more and more as we sort of dig into all these notions of authorship, since all these conservation plans and heritage plans draw their own boundaries, which are somehow as random as partitioning countries. They are partitioning the campus in terms of authorships and kind of determining what goes into the conservation plan and what doesn't. And whether it was Professor Vasauda talking with Bijoy recently at the BIC podcast, or if you talk to the various people, Doshi onwards, whether it was Satsangi, Hazra, the Jains, Professor Vasauda, even Sharad Shah when he was alive, who was the structural engineer on site, Mahindra Raj, who was the consulting engineer. What happens is we tend to reduce it. And I don't need to tell you this, but I thought I'd just sort of, in the conversation, bring it up. We tend to think of it as a single patrimony. But what happens is when imports, to quote Guha's cricket article today, when import becomes indigenous, what it means is not just a formal, stylistic adaptation, which is what we learn in school. But what begins to happen when you read correspondences, etc., is that there is a very interesting back and forth in terms of how practices begin to evolve, emerge, a certain manner of education begins to get it emerges. And therefore, what I look at it as this moment, especially this particular campus, because I'm most intimately familiar with, is that it's far more interesting to follow the practice and the transfer of authorships, how it is, especially in buildings like the Kitchen Dining and MDC, how you could see initial sketches, later sightings, etc. Where I'm going with this is that it's actually slightly counter to our current ways of articulating star architecture, etc., etc. So on the surface of it, it does appear, yes, like this white male architect, and everybody else is his chelas sort of a thing. But when you begin to actually dig through the archives, when you actually begin to look at correspondences, which of course enough hasn't been done, because normally so far there are only formal studies of the IIM, and through language and imaginations we already possess. So for me, this is an opportunity, especially if we are at the stage where we are encouraging in our letter, the three of us, but also the larger community, saying, hey, it is not just about buildings, but it is about the relationship between buildings, so spaces between buildings, and the entire culture of the campus, both physical as well as what it stood for in terms of how the alumni were affected, what sort of people they became, how they viewed management, having learned in this institute. All these aspects are as important to now coming up and articulating how do we approach this sort of collective patrimony. I know it's patrimony still. Yeah, so in that sense, again, I don't know if I've just completely gone from what you asked, but I begin to look at it in terms of, hang on a sec, it's not just about star architecture as we understand it. There are other undercurrents that were occurring, and which is why the campus is a cohesive environment, primarily which is why there is a healthy proportion of alumni who are also able to articulate their experience beyond just either a style, a brand, or an object to be conserved. So I thought it was rather interesting.
I agree. I mean, in the sense that, there is a lot of work to be done on this sort of domestication of the imported, so to speak, and sort of even the opposition, sort of strange, well-established but questionable oppositions between the domestic and the imported, and the reverses of exported and the indigenous is also very interesting to look at in terms of what is the narrative of global modernism, and what is the story of modernism. And I've written in my new book about diffractive processes, where things are bouncing off each other in a sort of a polycentric system. But two or three things, I'm trying to, you guys have all brought up that, we've been looking at this for a while. And this is going on. And in part, one could say, well, it's 50, 60, 70 years since these works from the 50s to the 70s, let's say, were done. They are old buildings. So naturally, you're looking at repair, restoration, and destruction. So there's the normal cycle of architecture, which is 50 to 60 years. But there are other things going on as well, right? I mean, what from your sense, Riyaz, sitting in India, obviously we have Modi Sarkar, that wants to visibly and actively dismantle and distance itself from the Nehruvian heritage, right? That is its, clearly stated mission. So what do you think is the larger political context for all of this? Why are we seeing this now in this sense in India? Why this assault on architecture?
I think we'd like to believe that architecture is that important, really. So that's.
I didn't think it was. But by the assault seemed to suggest that it is.
Yeah, but Vikram, a different type of assault. It's not a direct assault, and if it was a direct assault, I think one could look at it as ironic, and one could look at it as something that is that one can counter or one can have a response to. I think it's a much more carefully crafted assault, and something that's a little bit under the radar, you could say. And why I'm saying this is look at the arguments and look at the scales at which they operate. Okay, let's say if I'm taking the Central Vista, or I'm taking the Hall of Nations, or I look at CEPT, or I look at IIM, there are three arguments that basically are looked at. There's safety, there's comfort, and there's efficiency. These are the three kind of criteria which have been molded in order to facilitate this. And all of this fits into the developmental kind of way of looking forward and so on and so forth. And therefore, you will get people crying, but why can't we, have more comfortable buildings than this cellular architecture, which is monkish, etc. And it will look at things at that level. And I think this is the modus operandi, that you make everything so subjective. You make it that it becomes impossible without you being able to come closer to it in order to establish value, that you can't defend this architecture anymore, or you can't defend anything actually, given the way that the rhetoric then is manipulated, and that you know very well where you're sitting. But what I mean to say is that even something like using the term modernism or modern architecture is in some way so far away from the actuality of Kahn's building that to frame it in that kind of very distant historical perspective makes very good sense. And I understand things which relate, say, the Kahn building in Ahmedabad to things that were happening in Italy and America, but they don't, that rhetoric actually creates a distance which doesn't allow the intimacy that, let's say, the alumni had while engaging with it, in order to defend that physical reality that is theirs. And the minute you take away the ability to give value to that experience that you've had, and to be able to find a language, to be able to express it, then it doesn't matter. A Kahn building is a Kahn building, it's a building. And then you can't defend a Kahn building or even talk about what's special about it, because you've subjectivized it to such a level that the special has no meaning. And that's the pervasive level at which the politics is working in India, and I think globally in many ways. But that's just to tell you why it's so important for, I think, many of us to actually put ourselves out there and sound subjective, and to say that we care about a particular building because it has value, and to be able to articulate that value quite specifically. And I think that's what the letter was trying to do. So yeah, just to put it in perspective of that larger dynamic, I don't know if it's been articulated. Again, I can sense there's a certain emotional dimension to this, but yeah.
I think both Shubhra and Riyaz raise the question directly or indirectly of memory. And I think that memory has been, of course, operates at multiple scales and multiple levels, right? So there is one, the whole project of privileging certain memories and erasing others. And history, of course, is a result of such inscriptions. But I think what our campaign manages to, we were talking about this recently, and we were saying, what is it that gets 1,200 people to sign on to a document? And I would like to believe it is what someone like Maurice Hobwachs calls collective memory. It is cultural memory. So people have different kinds of memories. For example, there are people here who have signed on to this, who own the Esherick House by Louis Kahn. But there are also people who have worked on these buildings, of course. And then there are people who have never visited these buildings, but for whom they form a certain kind of lexicon, for whom they form another kind of memory that is not experiential. And then there are students who are currently living in these dorms. There are people who lived in these dorms in the 80s who signed on to them. So people bring with them different kinds of memories, and it becomes a certain kind of collective memory. And as Riyaz said, it is one has to understand the intimacy and the collective value of these memories. And I think talking about memory in this case is, of course, very interesting, because Louis Kahn himself was obviously highly affected by a kind of architectural memory. And so one can trace all sorts of architectures, even within IIM. So there is a lot to be mined here in terms of thinking of this as a project that is beyond the kind of bricks and mortar functionalism, efficiency, and safety that has been so valorized right now in critiques of the conservation.
No, and it's also a moment, really. Again, these have all come from recent discussions amongst each other and larger. But to just say that this current proposed demolition is because of some larger agenda is also to sort of miss the other point that in general, especially institutional buildings, which are basically they're not domestic in their scale, also have suffered parallel to the political agenda, etc., from actually what Riyaz called, but I love that phrase, which was the slow demolition through negligence. And it is not just the material negligence, but it is we stop visiting and revisiting places, even through our imaginations. And part of it is also because institutions more and more become privatized, of course. So there are many currents happening. Why architecture is under assault? Architecture becomes just a product that serves a particular purpose, yes, but we haven't kept revisiting it. Clients or users who are custodians or people who inherit literally the architecture also forget about it because of the culture of low maintenance, zero maintenance. And so everything, rather than look at it in terms of value, therefore maintenance would be looked at as care, the whole language in the safety, comfort, efficiency takes away the practice element of it, whether it is, therefore maintenance becomes a functional aspect of managing something rather than a care aspect. And all these are values that when you read Kahn or whether you read Doshi or Raje, in some manner, when they say these are human institutions, it's in a way, it's a good reminder to come back to other issues that Kahn dealt with, apart from just his formal and geometric and compositional strengths and things that we value, that suddenly you're also reminded rather of other values that brought about this kind of architecture. And that is worth remembering as well. And then figuring out, okay, with those memories, how do we move forward? So
indeed.
It's been really interesting that way.
In that sense, this podcast that we are recording right now, my opening has three architects saying, talking about architecture. If you remember, there is Bjarke Engels, and then there's Rem Koolhaas, and of course the third is Kahn, saying there is no such thing as architecture. Yes. But of course, I've truncated it there because the rest, then after his long dramatic pause, he says, of course, there is the spirit of architecture. And that's the real thing. And in that sense, to a certain extent, the interesting thing about Kahn is that on the one hand, he said architecture was not the building as such. It was the discourse and the spirit and the and the institutions and the conversations and the inhabitations and the memories and the so on and so forth. On the other hand, he gave to, let's say, literally the brick, a kind of facticity, which was beyond discourse, right? I mean, I have always, asking the brick what it wants to be, I have always loved to take that literally. There should be a quantum way to actually have that conversation in a post-ontological manner. We are finally catching up to Kahn, I think, today in contemporary discourse on what that would mean. To come back and stay with our topic at hand, let's stay with Ahmedabad. Okay, if we don't want to generalize even India or internationally, there are obviously people and discourses and forces that see the same inhabitation of IIM in a different way, right? Who would like to erase and rewrite through different lenses, right? I mean, discourse, all of us are part of a certain sorority. But there are other forces at play too. What is it about Ahmedabad and its history from your perspectives over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years? How did the change in discourse come about? On the one hand, it's the cutting edge of discourse in Indian architecture. But at the same time, it also felt like a remarkably feudal place to me. What are the force fields that bring about this kind of a battle, that bring us to a point where the great modernist heritage, let's say, of Ahmedabad is under siege?
There is an incredibly important piece by Mona Mehta called Ahmedabad Middle Class Megacity that I think everybody should read. And of course, you wanted to curtail the conversation and said, we can talk about Khan for 3 hours, but we can talk about this for 30 hours, of course. But essentially what Mona Mehta untangles is really a conversation or really a symptom that has played itself out not only in Ahmedabad, but in many places around the world, which is the relationship between neoliberalism and power. And how somehow this notion of a mega city, smart city, this idea that somehow we have to be on the global stage has inevitably come at the cost of history. It has come at the cost of voices that are constantly muzzled. And so, neoliberalism has a huge role to play in the creation of brands and identities. And nowadays, of course, cities have these brands and identities. And one of the things that started when Narendra Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat was this idea of vibrant Gujarat, where essentially they would have these huge melas, invite companies from around the world and sign all kinds of MOUs for hundreds of crores. Most of them didn't actually materialize, but it was this idea that we have to somehow be on a global map. We have to compete with Shanghai and Dubai, and that is the only lens of competition. That is the only platform on which we can stay. So it's very interesting that even something like a heritage, which has now acquired a huge it's a loaded term, especially in the context of the old city of Ahmedabad, that before the whole kind of UNESCO World Heritage City status, of course, old city Ahmedabad went through decades of neglect and demolition. And a lot of the old pole houses were removed, some facades taken directly to places in New Jersey and sitting in apartments in London. So I think one cannot remove the idea of what is considered world class from what is then projected onto people as an aspiration. And so that I think is very important, the way in which a whole mass of people is led to believe on what is considered to be progress and so on. But I want to bring the conversation back to IIM just in this context, because I think it's very interesting that while on the one hand, we were protesting the demolition of these dormitories, I think there are also interesting, maybe less obvious success stories. The School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, designed by B.V. Doshi, at this very same time is undergoing an immense conservation effort, where they are recasting the concrete of the roof. And it's a pretty major surgery, but it is done completely from the lens of conservation. It is not inviting a new architect to rebuild that building. So I think that I find it very interesting that there are also provincial, as you called it, but there are also movements that are counter, that are very real, that have even been taken on non-architectural, buildings, slum relocation efforts. There is a serious there is a serious voice against neoliberalism, although neoliberalism may be the frontier, or maybe the dominant narrative, the dominant narrative. But I think there are many movements that one can already find and voices of resistance.
To kind of talk about what Sarosh has started in a slightly different way from the ground, is actually what's changing is, and it's the intersection between architecture and the city will be the way that we are able to access land. And the politics of land is completely being transformed by the way that our government works right now. And the scale of land parceling that was not possible even 20 years ago is being made possible by government processes, by public processes that play the gallery, if you like, to big business in the Indian scale. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. And I think that, what kept Ahmedabad provincial is, we would like to think that it's cultural, and we'd like to think that it's, it's a social kind of glue, the middle class and so on, which of course there's a dimension to it, but it's also the scale at which people gather by the way that they access land and the way that they group land together. So the way that you are able to agglomerate land today, and the politics of that, is shaping the way that cities actually grow, and the way that cities are expanding. So if I look at, let's say, Ahmedabad, as you said, between 20 to 30 years ago, you can talk about a metropolitan Ahmedabad today if you look at a map. Whether when you inhabit Ahmedabad, you feel like you're in a metropolitan city is a very, very interesting question. That your experiences of Ahmedabad will not be more metropolitan. They will be what you perhaps call provincial, even its architecture. When you get architects from Bangalore and Bombay, they will marvel at the level of articulation of a commercial building in Ahmedabad. Oh, they use exposed concrete, and it will be kind of ladled on that we have a modern tradition and so on. But the point is that in spite of that, what you're talking about, the middle class and the provincial inhabits this incredible vast scale, which was not seen earlier. And so what I'm getting at is that when you put a flyover next to IIM, really it's a conflict of scales that we are talking about, where the forces of the city, which require you to put a TOZ zone, a transport development zone next to an institutional building, and the zonal requirement is an FSI of 4, then puts a kind of virtual pressure on the campus to behave in the same manner as the city. And that's the kind of dynamics that's being played out through the politics and the land agglomeration. And there is no kind of thinking about this. There's such a blanket, and this is why I say the far view is really destroying this architecture, because you can put a standard a zoning principle across the city, and you don't realize that the kind of building that's coming up valorizes the mall or the shopping block of a certain type, a commercial building of some. But if, like, for example, if you take the old city of Ahmedabad, where the BRTS goes through, it's largely manufacturing units, and there is no building type that talks about development from the perspective of, let's say, a small shopkeeper on Ghikata Road. Okay, and therefore, what development means vis-a-vis what's on the ground, that tension is being stretched to a limit that you're experiencing in the city like never before. And I think this is the politics that's being played out on institutions, on infrastructure, on the tension between a temple and the BRTS route when they have to cut through Hollywood area. All of these things are being played out. So I just say that small provincial scale and this grand plan that's somehow being played out.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.